Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Windows IT Pro web seminar, Azure Security and Identity Management Best Practices, sponsored by Rackspace. If you have any technical difficulties during today's session, please press the Help widget on your player console to receive assistance in solving common issues. And if at any time you are having audio difficulties or issues with advancing of the slides, simply hit your F5 key to refresh your webcast console. Today's web seminar is being recorded and will be available on demand for 12 months starting tomorrow. You'll receive an email when it is ready. And with that, let's meet today's speakers. Jeff DeVerter is the Chief Technologist for Microsoft Technology at Rackspace and is responsible for the roadmap and delivery of fanatical support for Microsoft Technology. Jeff has been with Rackspace for over 7 years and has built several service offerings, including dedicated SharePoint, Exchange, and Link, as well as Microsoft Cloud Platform. Benjamin Villanueva is an Azure Solutions Architect expert on identity and access management for Rackspace and is also a Microsoft Certified Solutions Master in Directory Services. He has spent his past 25 years in IT working with identity and access management products and solutions for Microsoft. Benjamin has also worked as an IT consultant for a number of industries, focusing on large enterprise customers across the globe. Garrett Rame is the Director of Strategy and Operations for Rackspace Managed Security and is responsible for the development, implementation, and support for all customer-facing security products and services. Garrett has served in a number of roles at Rackspace, including internal security architecture and product management. He was also responsible for creating the Barbican key management product, which is now part of the official OpenStack ecosystem. And the floor is now yours, Jeff.
Well, thanks, Jen, and thank you everyone who's come in here today to listen to this webinar about identity and security as we think about moving out into the cloud. In today's webinar, hopefully we'll take on a little bit of a different flair as opposed to just some slides that we get talked to, because the reality is today we have some pretty interesting folks in the room with us, and that's Garrett Rame in our security world, and then Benjamin Villanueva, who is an Active Directory certified master. And what that tees up for us is an environment where we can talk about things you have to think about when you're moving an application from an on-premise environment or even from Greenfield, if this is a new app, and getting it out running inside of Azure, and some of the things that you have to think about. And it's not things that you have to think about some of the time. These are things that you have to think about all of the time, and the things that you have to think about even once it's deployed to make sure that either it's still secure, up to spec, behaving the way it's supposed to. There's any number of these things that you have to think about. And when thinking about moving out into the cloud, we've got a few challenge points here on this slide that you can see. The first is this expertise is hard to find. Now, in my past experiences, about 8 years here at Rackspace, I started building SharePoint environments and supporting those customers in Exchange, and then Skype for Business, Link, however you want to call it, and private clouds, and now out in Azure. I've had the opportunity to see hundreds and hundreds of applications, some stuff off the shelf like the SharePoint Exchange, and some of it being custom applications, either apps running on top of those platforms or just brand new platforms. And the reality is when you think about all the complexity that goes into that, it is hard. And not necessarily just because it's beyond anybody's individual IQ, but it's muscles that that the common person doesn't necessarily exercise every day. And it's stuff that you have to think about when moving beyond the four walls of your own data center. In your own data center, you've got a certain set of givens that you can count on. If you're creating a three-tier application with a web tier and an application tier and a database tier, and it's going into your data center, security is taken care of. That one meeting that you can go talk about information rights and data security is going to check the check boxes just so they can make sure you're putting the right stuff in there and they can snap their tools into your app. But when going out into the public cloud, going out into Azure, you've got to think about all of this stuff for yourself. Not to say that the capabilities aren't there. It's actually sort of part of the problem. They are there, and they're there in spades, and you've got to figure out how to put all that together. So one of the main challenges, of course, in securing a cloud application is that limited access to security expertise and resources who really get how to do this sort of stuff. Now we think about how do we put some technology around this application to keep it secure. just as the cloud is a quickly evolving environment, the tools that are available are evolving just as quickly, whether it's new features and capabilities in existing ones, or whether it's new applications that are written to run specifically in one cloud or the other, or porting from an Amazon to an Azure, or vice versa. Jared, I'll just throw it over to you really quick, just to, if you've got any color you want to add around the complexity of third-party apps and managing clouds.
Sure. I mean, one of the major challenges we've seen for customers that are going out and moving to Azure, AWS, or some of the other cloud products is understanding and changing the internal tool sets that they built over years, right? So as they've gone out and gone vendors, from a security perspective, a lot of times those are large agreements that last for a long time, and those vendors have been slow to pick up native support for cloud properties. So really retooling the security operation to have the ability to do network visibility on Azure, right, can sometimes be different tool sets. It can be different skill sets and those types of things. And so, most analysts now are saying that organizations are deploying between 15 and 30 security tools in their environment to meet obligations. So just doing RFI, RFP, and purchase motions for those 15 to 30 tools is really very painful and time-consuming. And so a lot of customers are looking to Rackspace and other people who can come out and help them identify the tools that make the most sense when they're operating in a multi-cloud environment, and then being able to pull all of those tools together to deliver the operation.
Exactly. Thanks for that. And then as you think about increased adoption of cloud-based services, IT services, it's taking some of those things that you've been able to count on your data center specialists or your IT infrastructure folks to be able to handle. You're going to talk about this in a minute, Ben, but, identity is something that literally nobody thinks about, and now everybody has to think about.
I completely agree, Jeff. I mean, the big thing about identity is that we need to start thinking about it now as a control plane, right? We need to start thinking about it, hey, this is what's governing my access to my resources and my stuff. These are things that I need to really think about and really control who has access to what, where, and when.
Yep.
And bring in the security controls that Jared is talking about, and bringing in those ones into a system that plays well with what you have today in your own data center, your own industry, your own environment, and how that all plays into adopting some of these cloud resources, adopting them in a fashion that makes sense for your business, in the sense that in the roadmap and your strategy planning, all these things that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit, because it just makes sense to use the capacity that the cloud has, benefiting you as a company, and grow with it together.
That's right. That's right. Anxious to hear your comments on the identity piece. It's coming out of large data centers before coming to Rackspace 8 years ago. Thinking about how I'm going to control access was something we never thought about because we knew we counted on the corporate's Active Directory environment, and we knew we could just consume what was going there. And of course, the last piece of challenge is the ever-evolving compliance requirements. Those requirements are coming from a lot of different areas. When it was tucked in our own data center, it was really just what our data records folks said went, and that was how we classified our data and what we had to do from a compliance perspective. But when we think about exposing this information out on the internet, some cases through our data center, but if it's out inside of a public cloud, like out in Azure, those requirements take on a whole new flair from a you can talk about PCI, you can talk about HIPAA, you can talk about any number of other things, even before you start thinking about some of the federal regulations around some of the financial services aspects. And so having a company that can help figure that stuff out and help coach you along is pretty huge. All right, so as we step into the next area, what we're going to talk about, and this really just is our pretty graphic that shows our agenda for today. And what we want to do is take you through 4 things and 4 areas that they're very broad brush, mind you. We only have an hour to talk about this stuff, is that the things that you have to think about when considering taking an application out into the public cloud. We've been beating this horse up a whole lot so far, and we're only 10 minutes into this, but identity and authentication strategy, it's huge. How do we manage the Azure infrastructure in a compliant, functional, secure way? VM best practices. What's that to-do checklist look like that we need to consider when spinning up infrastructure inside of Azure? By the way, this would apply for AWS or Google Compute. You name the platform. These are things you have to think about. And then not just systems operations and IT operation activities, but what do we have to do from a security operations perspective? What needs to be considered for your application as we move this out? Now, know that these are things that you have to think through when we think about solving this for individual applications, which means you got to think through this for every application that goes out there. Now, if you're doing this in a mature enterprise way, you're going to have repeatable operations to help you think through this and your business units to think through this for each of these sections for each of your applications. But this isn't a one-time application. This is an every time an app goes out, and then review it over time. All right, with that in mind as our tee up, let's start to dig into identity. Now with us, as you've already heard from, is Ben. Ben is the smartest guy in authentication that I know. We brought him into Rackspace just over a year ago. He's a certified AD master, which means he had to take a whole lot of classes and a whole lot of tests to prove that he was the smartest person in the world about that, and really spends all of his time thinking about how do you apply the old world of AD into an authentication strategy of the 21st century. I just made that title up. You can write a book about it.
Sounds like a good idea. So one of the things that we need to think about when we're doing this is I want to take some of our experiences that we've had with our previous customers and put into a slide that sort of makes sense. Like there's a progressive nature that we go through when we're talking about an IAM strategy, right? How do we take what the company has today, its investments that it's done with Active Directory, and how do we leverage those tooling and capabilities and incorporate those ones into the cloud? So one of the things that we do here at Rackspace, right, is we have a managed service, managed identity service offering, and that allows us to do is talk to customers, really understand what their needs are, and really understand how we can address what their strategy is going forward. When we're talking about the strategy, as I said before, right, we need to think about identity as the control plane. No longer is it just a username and password that you need to have, but now you know how to think about it as like, well, there's all these other things that I need to start thinking about, right? There's all these, now that I've extended my Active Directory onto a different cloud provider, well, what are all those controls that I have? How can I take the controls that I have today in place and move those to the cloud and have those same granular controls that I'm used to having? Sure. So for us to be able to understand what that journey looks like for organizations, what we do is that we take a very brief, what we call an Active Directory health assessment, right? Everybody, all the customers that I've talked to, there's always gone through this transition period of so many cooks have come into the kitchen. You know, you have a lot of Active Directory people that have come and gone within the company. Everybody's following different best practices. Everybody's been following other things. And so now we do a health assessment, right? What are the things that you need to do to be able to move forward and provide your domain a cloud readiness, right? How is it that your cloud gets ready, and what are the things that you need to have in place to be able to do this readiness check? So we do this cloud. We make sure that Active Directory is configured with the correct attributes that are needed, with the correct permissions that are needed, with the correct resources that are needed to be able to do this extension. Okay. When we extend it, right, there's two different ways that we extend it, right? There's two things that Microsoft considers extending your Active Directory. And we're talking about using Microsoft Azure Active Directory as the primary plane that we use to leverage some of these technologies. And the reason we chose them is because this is the second year in a row that they've been the leader in the Gartner's Magic Quadrant of IAM solutions, not only for their capabilities, but also for the advancements that they've done, the services that they're offering. And we work real closely with Microsoft to making sure that we're building the best solution for it.
So the strategy then that we have in place here at Rackspace is where we're taking and enabling a customer to take their on-prem Active Directory and extend that into Azure Active Directory. So that becomes that central point, that control plane, to use your phrase, of authentication.
It does. And the reason we do that is because there's two different ways that you can look at it when you're extending, right? And I have this right here where it says you can either do a synchronized or federated identity, which people know them also as a same sign-on, where you log in with the same username and password, but you don't have this true federation. When you do true federation, that's what we call true single sign-on, right? Where you have access to all the applications and it sort of just automatically signs you in. We talk about application integration too, is that there's a lot of work that is done with a lot of companies, especially SaaS applications. You see more and more of them growing. Well, now we need to provide you a way to just integrate that identity, that control plane that you have, and provide access to those applications using the same controls that you have for your same username and password, and extending those ones into those applications, those SaaS applications that you have over there. Other things that we've looked at when we're talking about strategy too is that we need to look at multi-factor authentication. We know that today's world, there's so much more attacks that are going on at the surface level that of people just taking username and passwords. You can see one recently, 150 million passwords and username and passwords has been compromised.
Yeah.
Well, multi-factor is one of those things that we can do to alleviate some of these things. So how does that look like? Where do you implement it? Who needs it? Who doesn't need it? How do you really take those ones? And once we've gone through the multi-factor authentication, then we can go, as we go on through like this roadmap building, we'll privilege identity management. Where do we do is how we take the privilege identity of these really high value accounts, like domain admins, for example. A lot of times when we go with a lot of organizations, we see that domain admins accounts have a tremendous amount of users that are in there that don't need to have domain admins, and they're using it for the day-to-day basis on those ones, right? It just opens you up for a can of worms, as you know, that you can't control those ones, those credentials being compromised or so forth. When we talk about privileged identity, is also like, how do we do just-in-time administrative, right? How do we know that if somebody needs to do something that requires elevated permissions, how do we go about and just do that just-in-time administration? And when we go to the cloud, it's the same thing, right? Now you have domain admins, but for your cloud resources. You have to do the same thing, right? You have to have this privileged identity up at the top as well. How do you make sure that when they need to do global changes to the top, that those changes are reflected, are audited, and are monitored? And one of the things that we really love is that when you extend your Active Directory into the cloud, well, now you have this monitoring of suspicious activities. That means that we take the full advantages of the cloud and what it has to do with all the machine learning that it has, and it lets us know if there's any suspicious activity between the user accounts.
So when I hear you use a phrase like machine learning, it tells me, you can tell if my machine is running hot or if I'm doing a lot of work on it. I really don't like that term Microsoft uses, which is machine learning.
Agreed.
What does that mean in the context of identity? Because it means something very special.
Sure. And so when we're talking about really specifically about machine learning for identity, this means that it learns patterns. And Microsoft world machine learning is that it's taken what it's used with its 1 billion authentications that it does daily and learns from how people are using those accounts. When there is accounts that have been compromised, there's an average of about 10 million accounts that have been compromised by Microsoft on a daily basis. They have a great security report out there explaining exactly what they do for their machine learning process. And they learn from those attack patterns, those attack vectors, where they're coming from, who they're coming from. And it enables you as an organization to take extend that learning into your environment to really understand who and what is doing that work, right?
So it's really just not about a machine, but it's actually cognitive type services. It's really paying attention to behavior.
And what it is it's really proactive, right? Is that it alerts you ahead of time, like, hey, here's something suspicious, go check it out, right? So you have this alerting that goes along with it, and that goes into reporting and the auditing. Because that plays a huge role. When you're deploying your applications, your workloads, like you say, you need to know who accessed those applications, who did those, who audited, who was the one that accessed them, and who did that. Finally, we get the conditional access policies, right? Who needs to access to what areas and so forth, right? Where I only want people inside of my organization to do it. And of course, once you do that, you need to have all of the ongoing services going with that. Cloud grows at a big, rapid pace. We need to grow with them. And so when we go with the growing the cloud, that brings taking all of what I've talked about and put it into this pretty picture right here, right?
There's a lot in this picture.
There's a lot in this picture because organizations that I've dealt with a lot of time have done with enterprise computers, and now they have enterprise devices. But now as organizations grow, now you have a lot of people bringing their personal devices. They have a lot of people using public computers. You have a lot of things that are out of IT's control, but you want to make sure that you still have some of the control of that information that's on that device. And so we need to make sure that we provide these application channels, that we bring them into the right identity plane for you to be able to manage those services. And not only are we just talking, before we used to talk about employees, but now we're talking about partners, contractors, customers, et cetera, right? We're starting to do all of these applications that we're starting to use the cloud more. We need to provide this whole plane of your identity and extend it to all of our other people that are using it, right? How do we take that and use that? And so that's where I think we add a lot of value, and is bringing those things together for a company.
That's right. And so when I think about, of course I know you've been here for about a year, but as part of your interview process, and I looked at your resume, and Ben's been doing messing with identity in some fit or fashion for the past 25 years. And I feel like with where we are from a cloud perspective, that you're finally the cool job. It's finally in something that's not just tucked in the back of a data center trying to figure out who can authenticate to what on their first day. But the reality is now you're helping to enable folks be in control of one of the most important assets, and that is the identity of those different communities you mentioned, whether it's an employee, a business partner, customer, or some fractional variation of that in there. So identity, gosh, we really just can't say it enough, that we really need to, it's one of those things that has to be thought about as we move forward.
Yeah, and so I wanted to take how Rackspace has, so I just wanted to take an example of exactly how Rackspace takes an approach to a specific scenario, right? When we're dealing with customers and customers' environments, well, we want to take a really good security posture for those ones. And when we talk about our identity of who has access to those resources and to those subscriptions, well, let's look at this, what we call our Azure access. We have a really fantastic, phenomenal Rackspace Azure team here at that provides all the support for our customers. And so when we receive a ticket for somebody that needs something done in their environment, our Rackspace support team uses and enforces what we call a dual-factor authentication, right? We have what we call our Rackspace support bastion hosts, which are just an RDP gateway that allow us to securely authenticate our Rackspace support team and use those dual-factor authentication as our secondary form to prove that the support person has access to those resources. And then from there, it goes into a jump box within the Azure environment on the customer's premise itself, which itself is locked down by security measures that only allow RDP from our bastion host that you see right here. Yeah. And from there, once we're inside that environment, then from that host, we're able to RDP into the other boxes. But at no point is there any other open port availability within the Azure one, right? So nothing can access it unless it's through our Rackspace network itself, secured by what you see here.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons I really enjoy these sorts of webinars. What you see on the screen right now is how Rackspace figured it out to do it for N number of customers, and there are just tons of them that we have the opportunity to support. But there's nothing overly unique here outside of what we wrote around what we call Azure Access, but it's not anything that a large enterprise who wants to manage and control all aspects of this that they couldn't do. So what we offer here is a pattern. This is one of the ways that we've done it. We think it's the best way because, well, we did it. But that there isn't anything that says you couldn't take this and figure out how to do it on your own. Again, the value for a managed service provider for any number of companies is, it's one of those things they don't necessarily have to think about when you find a partner who has a method and a methodology for doing it. If you're in the process of interviewing different service providers for how to do this sort of thing, ask them. Please ask them what their process is for securing the level of communication and connections all the way through. It's one of the things you will absolutely need. Hopefully this is one of the takeaways that you can put to work extraordinarily quickly here. All right, so as we progress forward, the next thing you need to think about is from a VM perspective, and guys, this was like 15 slides at one point, and we realized that wasn't realistic. And in order to do justice to all of this, we're really just going to skim through a lot of this. I would pay close attention to the fine folks here at Penton who helped us out with this, because this is a future webinar, and that is what do you have to think about when you think about managing and securing machines? Now, we think about Azure, you think about any of the major public clouds, you've got different types of compute resources or cloud resources. I'm going to define them super quick just so that we're all on the same page, because I think words are important. So the first is infrastructure as a service. It's where all clouds really began in some fit or fashion. And infrastructure as a service really just means I can get storage, compute, and networking from another provider, and they're going to manage all the stuff that makes that work. And in the end, I get a pretty web page that says I can provision this stuff on a size and a memory allocation and storage requirement that I want, and it's available for me to do what I do. That's infrastructure as a service. Next from that would be platform as a service, and that's where that cloud provider has taken a bunch of infrastructure and turned it into a platform of technology to make it available. For instance, if you had infrastructure as a service and you had a basic web application that had a database tier and had a web tier, well, maybe your cloud provider has taken that and turned it into a platform of cloud sites like Microsoft did and made the ability for you to get storage and just web services agnostic to what's going on the infrastructure side. And then lastly would be software as a service. And software as a service would be where they really turned that into a complete application. For instance, Office 365. You know, you don't have to spin up Exchange servers. Exchange is part of the operation, as well as SharePoint and about 1.5 million other things. But it's made available for you to just consume and use, and you really have to think about nothing. So when we talk about VM best practices, it's talking about that infrastructure side, because what we've seen in both of our different offerings here at Rackspace, whether that is on the Azure side or on the AWS side, is in some fit or fashion there is a virtual machine that is a key aspect to running the application that's gotten moved out into Azure. And as such, it's also one of the areas that is the most susceptible to issues. When a company has the ability to put lots of boundaries and thought and process around managing a platform or a software as a service application, a lot of these things are just taken care of. But when we think about just that lowly VM as if it has no purpose, but it's valuable to us here. But just because it's running out, and in this case Azure, it doesn't mean we can just throw the Windows guy at it and everything gets solved, because there's lots of things that has to be thought about. For instance, backup. Do we care about backup, or is this machine part of a scale set that can be torn down or built up on a moment's notice? Updates. How are we going to manage those VM updates, whether it's Windows, whether it's Linux? There's always patches coming out for the operating system or even for an application that's running there. Antivirus. Are we sure that there's antivirus there? Because we're sure there are viruses. And we need to make sure that that's something that's been thought through. What is our antivirus strategy? Do we have a company that we prefer most for that strategy? How are we going to update the signature files? ... ACLs or access control lists. Who has access, or what aspects of the network have access to come into this machine? Is it a database server that should only be accepting requests from its application servers? Well, we can put controls in place that will only allow it to do that. Does it create? That absolutely creates additional things that need managed, but it also creates the right infrastructure posture of securing this VM. Or is it a web tier that really needs to be able to accept traffic from anywhere in the world, but maybe only port 80 and port 443 for web traffic? Hardening. How are we going to ensure there are no extraneous ports that have been exposed to the internet? How are we going to make sure that there are all services, only the services that are required are actually running, and that all other ones are disabled and not enabled for restarting at boot up? Monitoring. How are we going to pay attention to the health of this machine? And then lastly, automation. Automation both inside of the VM as well as the creation and destruction of the VM based on any number of conditions, like, for instance, load, or if monitoring has triggered that there is a significant issue running on the box. Do we have automation that can tear it down and build us a new one? Antivirus. What if monitoring says that it reads from antivirus, it says there's an irreparable virus that's running on in here, and it would actually take more time to fix that machine than it would just to tear it down and have automation create a new one. So VM best practices. Watch for some future webinars from Rackspace here around specifically how to do some of these things. But figuring out what your posture is on managing this asset known as a virtual machine, you got to think through that stuff. All right, which takes us to, well, now that we've thought through identity and we've thought through from an infrastructure perspective how we're going to manage this VM and how we're going to harden it and secure it and monitor it and all those things, now we have our application that's running and it's serving up just the most quality data out to our users. How are we going to think about security? And I can think of nobody better to answer this question than Jarrett Rame to walk us through the next few slides on things that need to be thought about when securing your application in the cloud. So Jarrett, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So one of the challenges that customers run into is really kind of rethinking the way that we secure things when they're moving to different infrastructure platforms, right? And public cloud and public clouds like Azure and AWS are kind of the most common ask today, but this has been a historical problem that we've run into in lots of areas. When data centers first started to go from dedicated to virtualized platforms and moving to VMware and Hyper-V or public clouds around OpenStack and some of these other types of components. So when we back up, one of the challenges that most quickly shows up when we start talking with customers is a real prevalence to jump straight to tools, right? By looking at, oh, okay, well, I'm moving to Azure. I need to go out and find some security tools that know something about Azure and that work on Azure, right? Or VMware, or I have this new security threat that I'm reading about, and so I need to go find a tool that goes and solves that particular security threat. And tools are an important part of the offer. At Rackspace, we tend to say they're about 10% of the problem. Right, so it's critical that you do have the right tools for the problems that you're trying to solve, but more critical are the people and the processes that are involved in actually using them. When you look at the pricing for building a 24/7 security operations center, you're tending to see somewhere in the $3 to $5 million a year range because going out and finding these folks is very expensive. Right, Gartner did a study that they released a couple of months ago that said that out of their customer base, about 15% currently have security operations centers. And they see that moving to about 50% by 2020, and that number of security analysts just doesn't exist. Right? So when people are going out there and trying to find the security analyst group, they're incredibly expensive, they're difficult to retain, and so there's really an open question for a lot of our customers as to whether or not that's investments that they want to make. Right? Is running a security operation internal to your business core competency? Right? Do you want to invest that level of money and expertise and time in going out and building those platforms, right? And in addition to that, you do still have the tools problem, right? So as we said before, most customers are deploying between about 15 and 30 different tools in their environment. And so going out and evaluating the hundreds and hundreds of different platforms that are out there today, venture capital has been very active in the security space in the last 4 to 5 years. It's a quickly growing market. It becomes very difficult to evaluate all of those platforms, analyze whether or not they're actually solving a problem that you have. Really even identifying the security problems that you have as a business are relatively difficult challenges to do. And so as we stepped into this market from a Rackspace perspective, we knew we wanted to help in these capabilities. We wanted to help customers understand that the threat landscape will constantly evolve, right? Understanding what threats your business is under is the place to start when you start thinking about what type of security operation you need to run, right? There are so many different ways that a company can be attacked that if you try to protect against all of them, you'll spend all your money very quickly and you will be unsuccessful, right? So by really focusing on the type of things that drive threat in your environment, right? So what vertical are you in? What technologies do you use? What type of data do you store, right? By looking at all of these different types of things, we can start to identify threat actors or bad guys out there in the network and which that are likely to come after this particular customer or this particular group. And that allows us to look at their tactics, techniques, and procedures that those threat actors use to attack customers, right? So by focusing on that, that gives us a place to say, hey, these are the likely things that we're going to see in this environment, right? So let's go and put defensive platforms in place that are capable of detecting those, right? And yes, that's tooling. That's also training your people. That's also understanding and priming those tools to protect against those threats, right? So you really have to balance what it is that you're trying to build in a security operation, right? So many customers go out and say, hey, I have X amount of budget, and so I'm going to go out and spend a ton of money on tools. And we all know that enterprise security tools are very, very expensive and tend to drive very difficult kind of sales processes around multi-year agreements and various other things to really try to lock customers in. And customers tend to get left without enough money to go out and really drive the operation, right? In general, like our recommendation will always be you're better off spending most of your money on people and process, even if that limits you to open source tooling, some of which is still quite good, right? So really a big capability as we go out and build this team and build those people and processes is really transitioning from the land of no, where security has historically been, to a business enablement model. As we've talked about in the identity components here, we're really looking at saying the business is going to go out and achieve an objective. And their decision around what platforms they're going to use to achieve that objective will be driven by business need, right? Does it for the business if this is on a dedicated infrastructure or on an Azure infrastructure? And it's no longer acceptable for security to sit back in the corner and say, no, you can't do that. We don't know how to secure that. This is a compliant application, or this has regulatory obligations, and so you can't put that out in Azure. we're now having to make sure that we go out there and understand how to do those things. And so by focusing your effort on those people and process side of things, that allows you to swap out the tooling. Right, so when you look at the Rackspace operation, for example, just inside Rackspace, I support dedicated 4 different private clouds and a public cloud. Then we have AWS and Azure. And so it's a lot of different platforms for us to support. And that means that from an operational perspective, I have to drive all the complexity of those operations down into the tooling layers so that my security analysts, it's the same. It's the same vision that they're focused on. They're looking at what information is coming from the environment, what we call security telemetry, right? And they're comparing that against threat intelligence that we have for customers, and they're deriving the intelligence and the knowledge about what's going on in that environment, and then they're taking action on that knowledge, right? So rather than just looking back and saying, hey, Mr. Customer, we see something bad in your environment, you should probably go do something about that, our analysts step into customer environments and interdict the attack, remove malware as needed, those types of things. And so to do all of that, the analysts need to not be worried about what the infrastructure that they're operating on top is. And that requires a lot of integration work, a lot of technology work, a lot of development work to link all of these tools together. And that's partially why Rackspace is very opinionated about the tooling that we deliver for customers, right? So we deliver a host and network-based protection platform, analytics, of course, to process all that information, vulnerability management and log management are all part of the managed security package. And by being really opinionated about the tools that we use to deliver those offers, then it means we can drive lower costs for customers, right? I need fewer rackers to deliver the offer because I only have to be an expert in the tools that I bring to the fight. I don't have to be an expert in every tool out there. And it also makes my automation a lot more effective, right? As we were talking about before, one of the key concerns when you're looking at how you secure your VMs is whether your developers and whether your development teams are treating those application platforms as what we like to call pets or cattle. Right? And pets, they're each individual servers with their own unique special Snowflake person that we take care of. And you log into them and you patch them and those types of things to kind of keep them up and running. And that's historically how we've deployed software. When you look at the pure public cloud model, more and more people are moving towards the caption, right? That each individual server is not special. And as Jeff was talking about, if you find a problem in a server, whether that's a security problem or a performance problem or a responsiveness problem, you just shoot that server in the head and you move on to the next one, right? You just have your automation platforms go and do that. And if you have those automation platforms in place, they can, of course, be used to solve security needs as well. So there's a lot of kind of focus that you can do in using those platforms that your IT and development teams are doing to drive security value, right? Rather than being the security team that comes on behind them and tells them what they have to do. So as we've talked about, the security operation is incredibly important in actually delivering and getting value from these tools. And really the Rackspace Managed Security component is really a detect and response offer, right? We assume that attackers will get in your environment. And I think we've proven that over the last couple of years with all the breaches that you've seen in the news, that sooner or later, if an attacker is willing to spend the time, energy, and money to get into your environment, they will do so. Right? And we've really moved away as a security community from talking about prevention, right? We can't really prevent them from getting in, but we can make it more difficult, right? So at Rackspace, we looked at this deterrence question, and we can say, look, we can't prevent anyone from getting in, so let's have the security operation that's capable of detecting and responding to attacks and removing the attacker from the environment before they're able to do any damage to the business. But we also want to do deterrence, right? And deterrence is basically making it more difficult or more expensive for an attacker to operate in your environment. And if you're real lucky, that means they're going to go bug somebody else, right? Because at the end of the day, most attacker platforms and threat actors are monetarily driven, right? And so if you increase the cost for them to operate inside your environment, they may go pick on somebody else. Or you may not be lucky, right? And it's a targeted threat actor that's going to continue to come after your environment. At the end of the day, most of these threat actor groups, this is their job, right? So they come to work, they spend all day trying to break into your environment, and when they're not successful, they go home, they have dinner with their kids, and they come back the next day and they do the same thing again, right? And so by focusing on that deterrence piece, well, maybe we get them to go play with somebody else. But if not, what we do is we slow them down. We make it harder for them to operate. We make it more expensive. And we make them be more aggressive, right? So if I'm making it more difficult for them to move around inside the environment, then that means they got to be more aggressive in trying to achieve their objectives. And by slowing them down and making them be more aggressive, that means my security operation has time to go and find them, right? And so by looking at that deterrence component, a lot of this is eat your vegetables type stuff. It's the type of stuff that all of us should be doing in your environments, right? It's vulnerability management, it's configuration hardening and monitoring, it's patch monitoring, user monitoring, the types of things that we've been talking about with your identity platforms around behavioral analytics and those types of things to understand when environments are compromised. Right? If you look at all that, all those things, they ratchet up your deterrence. They also check a lot of compliance obligations. So by focusing on that deterrence piece, you also get to secure and make your environment compliant, right? So most customers, another big mistake that we see customers make stepping into really any infrastructure, but especially cloud, is focusing on getting the environment compliant. Right? Compliant is a business necessity. You have to do it. There's no question about that. But the business value is around securing your environment. So if you focus on securing your environment, and as you're going along, making sure that compliance falls out of that, you'll get a much better use of money, a much better use of resources in driving the types of behaviors that you want to see in your environments. Right? And again, we talked about using automation to drive a lot of that ability. Right? If all of your servers are cattle, it becomes very easy to ensure things like configuration hardening, right? Because you've already got a Chef or a Puppet or whatever configuration platform you use, and you can say, hey, look, here's my configuration hardening piece. My security team spent the time to write the hardening code, and now it's automatically applied to every server. I don't have to harden every server. I just have to do it once, and then I can prove that it works, right? And we want to focus on visibility. Every security operation needs to have visibility. This is a key challenge for a lot of customers moving to cloud. Right? Typical visibility relied very heavily on span taps on network ports for switches and those types of things to get visibility into traffic in the environment. And we just don't have that luxury anymore, especially in cloud. But even in the dedicated environments, we're losing that now as you see the prevalence of encryption, TLS, and some of the new configurations around perfect forward secrecy and those types of things. Right? And then finally, at the end of the day, you still have to take that security operation and deliver the compliance value that you need out of it. Right, so you need a set of experts that understands the compliance obligations that you may have, be that PCI or HIPAA or ISO or whatever organization that you're trying to meet, and that are capable of looking at the information that's coming out of your security operation and translating that into something your auditor can understand. Auditors are still catching up and understanding how modern development is done, especially on public cloud. And so having someone on staff from an expertise perspective who can speak to the compliance people in a language that they understand, but also understands the technology of public cloud or private cloud or whatever platform you're using, is important in being successful in your audits. Right? It reduces their scope, reduces their cost, reduces the amount of time that the auditor spends looking at your information, because if you can explain to them and you can evidence to them in a way that they understand, they're going to spend a lot less time looking through your environment and consuming time for your people. Right? And so at Rackspace, we deliver the managed security offer and the compliance assistance offer to kind of meet these needs for customers. And a lot of times we end up talking with customers just about what's required to move to the cloud, regardless of whether or not they end up consuming our services. So it is very important for customers to think through all of these types of questions as you're digging through. All of these questions that we talked about with identity today, talked about kind of hardening virtual machines, talk about kind of getting into the security operations and compliance operations pieces of things, because as you set those operations up, it's not something you can do reactively, right? Because they are mostly people and process driven as opposed to tools driven, it's not something you can go out and spend money and then a couple of months later have an answer to, right? So by getting a lot of access to the experts who can help you design these platforms, it can really smooth and ease the way for your platforms to grow into using all of these different platforms in a multi-cloud world, whether that's dedicated servers, private clouds, or the various different public clouds that you may choose.
Well, I think that's an interesting point as well, Jared. When we very much compartmentalized through the earlier part of the conversation, thinking about cloud as its own unique thing, but what you're actually advocating here and considering is how do we just extend this posture so that it's just another endpoint and a thing that needs to be considered in whole, not just as in part. Excellent. All right, we have some cloud security resources that Rackspace has made available. You can see those on your screen. Feel free to grab those. One thing we didn't mention earlier is there is a nifty Q&A capability in this tool. So if you have questions along the way here or that have come up, please feel free to type those in. You've got us held captive here for the next little while. We'd love to talk about that a little bit more or answer specific questions that you may have. We do appreciate the nice thoughts that were put into there before. We do have a few questions that have made its way in. And one that comes here first is, what type of identity best practices do you use when moving customer identities to the cloud? Sounds like a bit of a softball over to you, Ben, but I'm going to throw that one to you. So, identity best practices. What are the 3 bullets you want our fine folks at home to remember?
Sure. So the biggest thing right now is your environment cloud ready? Meaning that is the best practice of getting your attributes in order, your Active Directory attributes in order, your Active Directory house in order to be able to go up and be part of the cloud or be extended into the cloud. The second thing is, what do you have for your strategy, right? What is it looking like? Where are you going to put MFA? Who needs MFA? What are you thinking about for your privileged identity?
What is MFA?
Multi-factor authentication. Sorry.
For the folks at home.
Yep. And finally, the third one is, well, now that you have this great exposure into the cloud, well, how do you leverage that to take advantage of your customers using federation and so forth?
So, Jared, now I'm going to throw this over to you real quick. So now we have a company who has extended their on-prem AD. It's now out in utilizing Azure. Azure Active Directory. We know to facilitate this, they have at least one network inside of Azure that's got about 6 to 8 servers running various forms of AD and ADFS and AD Sync capabilities. You know, we think about how we secure this. I'll just bounce this to you. How does a company then consider your services to help make sure that most precious asset stays their asset?
That's a good question. So I think there's 2 sides to this question for me, right? One is, as you mentioned, protecting the actual infrastructure that's running AD, right? It's always been that AD servers and domain controllers are always the #1 target for attackers when they get inside customer environments. So much of what we see modern attackers doing when they get in environments is understanding what the identity structure is inside of the company and then leveraging that identity structure to reach their goals, right? If we look at the big attacks over the last couple of years, about 75 to 80% of those started with a spear phishing attack that compromised a credential for an individual inside of an organization. And it's rare that individual has access to a production database storing customer information. So attackers have to leverage their understanding of identity to pivot across the infrastructure to get to that goal that they're trying to do. So when we look at securing domain controllers and those types of things, right, we have to go in and not only go and put the tooling in place, right? So we focus on putting agents on boxes that give us host-based visibility, kind of really deep visibility into every action that's going on the host itself. We also focus on getting network visibility and understanding kind of what the traffic is that's flowing through the environment. Pair that with vulnerability management, which allows you to make sure that you don't have the vulnerabilities for attackers to go get in the first place, right? And then we're looking at all the telemetry that's coming out of that environment to look for anomalous behavior, right? So much of understanding the modern attacker is that they're not going to trip a signature. Your intrusion detection system is not going to find them. If those things were going to be effective, they would have been for all the breaches that we saw for the last couple of years, because big guys like Target and those guys get beat up a lot now because they were in the news, but they were following best practices at the time that they were breached. It's just that those tools weren't effective against the type of attacker that they see. So you do have to go in, and we have to monitor all those tools. We also have to be very proactive, right? Tools are not going to find the APT or the advanced attacker. So we focus on leveraging cyber hunting missions into customers' environments. So we step into an environment, stands an alert, right, and look for evidence of an attacker in the space. That's driven by our level 3 analysts who have 10 or 15 years worth of cyber warfare experience, and so they're stepping into an environment and looking for the bad guys. And that can be driven by threat intelligence and a couple of other platforms that can drive us there. Right, so we have to protect that environment because it is the crown jewels. And by leveraging a centralized environment like an Azure Active Directory environment, as customers start to spread across these different cloud platforms, it really levels up what security operation can do for a business. So as you start looking at platforms like cloud access security brokers and various other platforms that kind of mitigate access for your users into the SaaS platforms or the platform as a service or the infrastructure as a service, as Jeff was talking about, by leveraging a single central identity platform, all that information can flow into your security operation. So now we can get really deep visibility into all the things that a user is doing, what they're taking out of box and moving into their email and those types of things, which can help us detect compromised credentials. Right? So it's critical to have that central identity. It's critical to protect it because it is your crown jewels. But by having that central identity and unifying that across your entire business, it gives you a lot of value both in user experience, right, but also in what security operations can do for the organization.
All right, excellent. I love the fact you're calling identity the crown jewels because, as you pointed out, Bob over in accounting doesn't have access to the prod data, but at least it gets the person an identity that they can start to then pivot around and figure some stuff out. All right, let's talk about real quick. We have a question in specific around DoD. For our friends who are working in and around the military, they're dealing with data that is of a sensitive nature. There's a lot of requirements that come to them from what networks they can be on or what they can be off. Now, as we know, both AWS and Azure have a federal cloud. They have a cloud that has been blessed and is attached to the .mil, where companies can, or companies, well, in some cases companies, I guess, yeah, absolutely companies, can store data that is of a sensitive nature as defined by the government. I'll put it out to both of you, especially Jarrett used a lot of fancy military terms, but, what are we aware of any sites from a military perspective that are running holistically in the cloud? And I've got an opinion and a thought about this that I'll share in a second, but I thought I'd throw it out to either of you to talk about that.
Sure. I mean, we talk with many customers who are focused on kind of GovCloud and those types of operations. I think, most government agencies operate like very large enterprises in that individual components of those particular platforms will move to cloud and have over time, right? And some of that was driven by ease of use and cost reductions, and some of that was driven by use cases that very closely match the abilities for public cloud, like really the spin up and spin down kind of model where they need to be able to scale up compute on demand and scale it back down much, much cheaper on a public cloud than building that type of infrastructure internally, right? I think recently saw NIST release their new risk management framework, and there'll be a paper coming out, an SP coming out here relatively soon that applies that directly to the cloud environment. So there's a lot of work happening in DoD. There's a lot of work happening in NIST to help not only government agencies consume these types of platforms, but just enterprises in general be able to understand how to morph and trade these internal processes that they've had for years to take into account the various risks that may come to cloud. Right? I think at Rackspace we tend to tell customers no environment is any more or less secure than any other one, but they do all require different approaches and they all have different risk profiles. So they may be very different for an individual organization, but cloud isn't insecure or dedicated isn't insecure, right? They're all just different approaches to solving the same problem. So really the goal of any security operation, certainly the goal of the Rackspace managed security operation, is to get to the point where the business always makes the decision of what infrastructure to use based on the business need that's driving the actual procurement. What problem are we actually trying to solve? What business value is that going to drive? Let's choose based on that. And then it's the problem of the security organization to understand how to drive, monitor, and protect that environment.
I really like the point there's no one environment that's more or less secure. You just have to come at it from different angles. And some you go to jail for if you don't do it quite right, which adds a little bit more excitement to the day. All right, let's see. I think we have another question here. What are the advantages? Back to you, Jarrett. What are the advantages of using Rackspace Managed Security Services? I think you've given about 10 of them, but condense a couple of bullets together here.
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a people, processes, and tools organization, and the vast majority of the work is people and process, right? So Rackspace can afford to go out and hire the best people in the business because we can spread that cost across a lot of customers. We can retain the best people in the business because, to be honest, a lot of them are coming out of the military and various other groups, and they want to stay in the fight against advanced attackers, right? We can afford to spread out the capabilities across a wide variety of people. So our Security Operations Center doesn't do vulnerability management. We have a separate team for that, right? And so add all that together, we also have 300,000 customers, and we get to sit on top of all the knowledge that we see from attacks across that infrastructure. For example, our CSO, Brian Kelly, recently set up an organization that allows us to trade threat intelligence between all the different cloud provider platforms, between us and Microsoft and Google and Amazon and these different groups. And so we can do a really good job at protecting customer environments. And at the end of the day, Rackspace Managed Security is an extension of the fanatical support you get from Rackspace, right? So I have the ability to step into a customer's environment and interdict an attack, right? Most managed security providers are alert-only services, right? So when they'll monitor your environment, they'll help you they'll give you work that you need to do in your environment to harden, those types of things. And when they see something, they're going to call you and say, hey, yeah, something bad's going on. You should probably do something about that. And because I sit on top of the rackers that are there to actually go and take care of the environment, I can leverage all of that ability to drive security value. I can step in and I can interdict an attack. I can remove it. And a secondary benefit to that, and it's a good example on a webinar today, is that anytime as a security guy I need access to an expert in a particular technology, I can pretty much throw a rock inside a Rackspace and hit one. So if I need an expert in Active Directory, there happens to be one on the phone today, I can find those internally. If I need an expert on SAN, I can find one internally. And so that allows the security operation to really deeply understand the infrastructure that's sitting on top of and tune for that.
Perfect. Thanks for that. It really is what happens when you're able to provide, and I think this really is a good definition even for Rackspace, and that is you're able to provide an army of experience on an individualized basis. And it's what we can do as we support customers inside our own data center as well as out in Azure or any of the other major cloud providers as well. It's about how we can help you out. All right, we have come to the end of our time here today. As you can tell, we could go on for hours on this topic. This is the beginning of the conversation. We'll be happy to keep in contact with you and let you know when the next one of these in the series will be. We really do appreciate you taking an hour out of your day to be with us and look at things you have to think about when moving out into the cloud. Note also, this is just a side note after having been a part of this for the past hour, not a whole lot overtly sexy in cloud computing going on here, but it's all stuff that has to be thought about and dealt with on an app-by-app, day-by-day basis. And it's part of what gets us excited about getting up in the morning and coming in to help our customers think through these things. So thanks for letting listen to us wax technical about this for the past hour. This will be available for replay after about 24 hours, I believe Jen had mentioned. And look for the next ones in the series of these, and ideally also a forthcoming white paper and guidebook on what needs to be thought about in moving out to the cloud. So for Ben, Jarrett, and myself, guys, we really appreciate your time today. And that's all we have.
Thank you.